In the summer of 2025, the world economy stood on the edge of a precipice, caught in the crosshairs of a brewing storm that would come to be known as the Tariff War. At the heart of this global showdown was U.S. President Donald Trump, a man whose brash rhetoric and unrelenting focus on America First had once again thrust him into the spotlight of international trade. His target? The BRICS alliance, a coalition of emerging economies led by Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, recently expanded to include Egypt, Ethiopia, Indonesia, Iran, and the United Arab Emirates. This group, representing over half the world's population and nearly a third of global GDP, was no longer a mere footnote in global affairs. It had grown into a formidable force, challenging the Western-dominated economic order with ambitions of a multipolar world. Trump, fresh into his second term, saw the BRICS bloc as a direct threat to American economic hegemony. His weapon of choice was tariffs. Steep, punitive levies designed to bend nations to his will. On July 7, 2025, as leaders of the BRICS nations gathered in Rio de Janeiro for their 17th annual summit, Trump took to Truth Social, his preferred megaphone, to issue a stark warning: any country aligning themselves with the anti-American policies of BRICS will be charged an additional 10% tariff. There will be no exceptions to this policy. The message was clear, but its implications were murky. What exactly constituted anti-American policies? Trump didn't elaborate, leaving the world to speculate and markets to tremble. The BRICS summit in Rio was meant to be a celebration of the bloc's growing influence. Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, hosting the event, framed BRICS as the heir to the Cold War's non-aligned movement, a platform for sovereign nations to assert their autonomy in a polarized world. The summit's agenda was ambitious. Discussions on cross-border payment systems, local currency trade, and reforms to global institutions like the United Nations and the International Monetary Fund. But Trump's threat cast a long shadow over the proceedings, turning a moment of unity into a diplomatic tightrope walk. The roots of the conflict. To understand the tariff war, one must first trace the roots of the BRICS alliance and Trump's fixation on it. The term BRIC was coined in 2001 by Goldman Sachs economist Jim O'Neill, who saw Brazil, Russia, India, and China as the future engines of global growth. By 2009, these nations formalized their partnership, with South Africa joining in 2010 to form BRICS. The bloc's mission was to amplify the voice of the Global South, challenging the dominance of the US-led G7 and advocating for a multipolar world where power was more equitably distributed. Over the years, BRICS evolved from a loose economic club into a geopolitical counterweight. The 2023 expansion, which welcomed Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Indonesia, and the UAE, signaled its growing ambition. Saudi Arabia, though invited, remained on the fence, wary of fully aligning against the US. The bloc established the New Development Bank in 2015 as an alternative to the World Bank and explored initiatives like the BRICS Contingent Reserve Arrangement and a potential cross-border payment system to rival SWIFT. Most provocatively, some members, notably Brazil and China, floated the idea of reducing reliance on the US dollar in global trade, a move that struck at the heart of American financial dominance. Trump's animosity toward BRICS predated his second term. In November 2024, as president-elect, he warned of 100% tariffs on any nation that backed a BRICS currency or sought to replace the dollar as the world's reserve currency. His rhetoric was fueled by reports from a 2024 BRICS summit in Kazan, where Russian President Vladimir Putin called for a new international payment system, decrying the dollar's use as a weapon in global finance. Brazilian President Lula had also proposed a common currency for South America in 2023, though the idea gained little traction within BRICS. For Trump, the dollar's dominance was non-negotiable. If we lost the world's standard dollar, that would be like losing a world war, he declared at a cabinet meeting in July 2025. His advisors, including Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, echoed his concerns, framing BRICS as a growing threat to U.S. interests. Yet, economists like Brad Setzer of the Council on Foreign Relations argued that the dollar's role as the world's primary reserve currency, accounting for 58% of global foreign exchange reserves, was far from endangered. Trump's threats, Setzer warned, could backfire, signaling weakness and accelerating de-dollarization efforts. The tariff gambit. Trump's tariff strategy was not new. During his first term, he had imposed tariffs on Chinese goods, sparking a trade war that disrupted global supply chains. In his second term, he escalated this approach, wielding tariffs as both an economic tool and a geopolitical cudgel. By April 2025, Trump had announced a wave of import taxes on goods from countries worldwide, some as high as 50%, under what he called Liberation Day. These were temporarily paused for 90 days to allow negotiations, but by July, the U.S. had implemented a baseline 10% tariff on most trading partners. The BRICS-specific tariff threat, announced on July 7, 2025, was a new escalation. Trump's 10% additional levy targeted not only the 11 core BRICS members but also partner countries like Nigeria, Thailand, and Vietnam. Letters were sent to 10 to 15 nations, outlining their tariff rates if they failed to reach trade deals by August 1. Treasury Secretary Bessent described the letters as a polite but firm ultimatum: "Thank you for wanting to trade with the United States of America. We welcome you as a trading partner, and here's the rate, unless you want to come back and try to negotiate." The U.S. had already secured trade agreements with the UK and Vietnam, and a partial deal with China, which relaxed some restrictions in exchange for increased rare earth exports. But negotiations with other BRICS nations, particularly India and Brazil, were fraught. India, which Trump dubbed the Tariff King for its 12% trade-weighted average tariff, faced intense pressure. An internal Indian analysis estimated that reciprocal tariffs could affect 87% of its $66 billion in exports to the U.S., costing $7 billion annually. Brazil, meanwhile, was targeted not only for its BRICS leadership but also for political reasons: Trump's support for former President Jair Bolsonaro, who faced trial for attempting to overturn the 2022 election. The BRICS response. The BRICS summit in Rio de Janeiro, held July 6 to 7, 2025, was a pivotal moment. Leaders, including India's Narendra Modi, South Africa's Cyril Ramaphosa, and Brazil's Lula, projected unity, but the absence of Chinese President Xi Jinping and Russian President Vladimir Putin's virtual attendance due to an international criminal court warrant underscored the bloc's challenges. The summit's 31-page declaration, titled "Strengthening Global South Cooperation for More Inclusive and Sustainable Governance," condemned unilateral tariffs as a threat to global trade and criticized U.S.-Israeli strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities. Brazil's Lula was particularly vocal, accusing Trump of acting like an emperor, and asserting the sovereignty of BRICS nations. "If he thinks he can impose tariffs, we can too," he declared, hinting at retaliatory measures. China's Foreign Ministry spokesperson Mao Ning took a more measured tone, emphasizing that BRICS was a platform for cooperation, not confrontation. "Trade wars and tariff wars have no winners," she said, reiterating China's opposition to tariffs as a tool of coercion. India, navigating its dual role as a BRICS member and a U.S. partner, adopted a pragmatic stance. External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar emphasized workarounds to sustain trade with Russia, particularly for oil imports, without directly challenging the dollar. South Africa, hit hard by a 31% U.S. tariff on April 2, 2025, which nullified benefits under the African Growth and Opportunity Act, condemned the levies as detrimental to its manufacturing sector. Russia, already isolated by Western sanctions, saw little additional impact from Trump's tariffs, given its 90% reduction in U.S. trade since the Ukraine invasion. The newer BRICS members, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Indonesia, and the UAE, faced varying degrees of exposure, with China's dominance in electric vehicles, batteries, and rare earths making it the most resilient to U.S. The global fallout. Trump's tariff sent shockwaves through global markets. On April 9, 2025, when the initial, reciprocal, tariffs took effect, the S&P 500 plummeted 274 points, and the Nasdaq suffered its largest single-day point loss ever. Bond markets also faltered, with Deutsche Bank's head of FX warning of a simultaneous collapse in U.S. assets. The Peterson Institute for International Economics, PIIE, projected that a 100% tariff on BRICS nations would shave $432 billion off U.S. GDP by the end of Trump's term, with inflation rising 1.6%. BRICS nations faced their own challenges. China's electric vehicle industry, which held 30% of the U.S. market, risked significant losses. India's IT, pharmaceutical, and textile exports were vulnerable, while Brazil and South Africa's agricultural sectors braced for competitive setbacks. The bloc's response was to double down on intra-BRICS trade and local currency settlements, such as India's rupee-based trade with Russia. The BRICS Chamber of Commerce and Industry pushed for trade corridors in fintech and renewable energy, particularly between India and the UAE. Globally, the tariffs exacerbated economic uncertainty. The BRICS declaration warned that unilateral measures could reduce global trade, disrupt global supply chains, and introduce uncertainty into international economic and trade activities. The International Chambers of Commerce's Andrew Wilson noted the difficulty of shifting away from China's dominance in key sectors, predicting supply chain disruptions. Meanwhile, G7 nations, though less targeted, faced collateral damage, with the EU scrambling to maintain a provisional 10% tariff rate. Chapter 6: The Geopolitical Chessboard. Beyond economics, the tariff war was a geopolitical power play. Trump's advisors, including Steve Bannon and Senator Eric Schmidt, framed BRICS as a malign force led by China and Russia, urging nations to choose between the US and the bloc. Trump's personal ties to Bolsonaro and his son Eduardo added a layer of ideological conflict, particularly with Brazil's Lula. The BRICS declaration's condemnation of U.S.-Israeli strikes on Iran further inflamed tensions, with Trump's support for the attack seen as a direct challenge to the bloc's call for international law. India, caught between its BRICS membership and its $120 billion trade relationship with the U.S., walked a delicate line. Prime Minister Modi's February 2025 visit to the White House aimed to double bilateral trade to $500 billion by 2030, but Trump's tariff king label and threats of reciprocal tariffs complicated negotiations. China, meanwhile, pushed for greater use of the renminbi and its ECNY digital currency, though experts doubted its ability to rival the dollar soon. Russia, sidelined by sanctions, used BRICS to bolster its narrative of Western decline, while smaller members like Ethiopia and Egypt sought to leverage the bloc for economic diversification. As August 1, 2025, approached, the deadline for Trump's tariff increases, the world held its breath. Would BRICS nations capitulate to U.S. demands, or would they retaliate, risking a full-blown trade war? The bloc's leaders, wary of confrontation, emphasized cooperation over escalation. South Africa clarified that no BRICS currency was in the works, focusing instead on local currency trade. Brazil's Lula advocated a gradual approach to de-dollarization, while India prioritized strategic autonomy. Trump, however, showed no signs of backing down. His administration's use of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to impose broad tariffs signaled a willingness to wield unprecedented economic power. Yet, critics warned that his approach could isolate the U.S., pushing BRICS nations closer together and accelerating efforts to diversify away from the dollar. The PIIE's analysis suggested that even without retaliation, the tariffs would harm both the U.S. and BRICS economies, with consumers bearing the brunt of higher prices. A world divided. The tariff war was more than a trade dispute, it was a battle for the future of the global economic order. Trump's tariffs aimed to preserve U.S. dominance, but they risked fracturing the interconnected web of global trade. BRICS, for all its internal disparities, represented a vision of a multipolar world where emerging economies could assert their sovereignty. The bloc's expansion and its push for alternative financial systems challenged the status quo, but its members faced the daunting task of balancing cooperation with their own national interests. As markets fluctuated and diplomats scrambled, ordinary citizens felt the ripple effects. In the U.S., consumers braced for higher prices on everything from electronics to clothing. In BRICS nations, exporters faced shrinking markets, while governments weighed the costs of retaliation versus negotiation. The world watched as the tariff war unfolded, a high-stakes drama with no clear victor in sight. The human cost. Behind the headlines and economic forecasts were real people, farmers in Brazil, factory workers in China, tech professionals in India, and consumers everywhere. In South Africa, the Steel and Engineering Industries Federation warned of job losses as U.S. tariffs hit local manufacturing. In India, small businesses exporting textiles to the U.S. faced uncertainty, while in China, EV manufacturers scrambled to find new markets. Even in the U.S., companies like Walmart warned of price hikes, contradicting Trump's claim that tariffs would have no inflationary impact. The human toll extended beyond economics. The tariff war deepened global divisions, fueling nationalist rhetoric and straining diplomatic ties. Lula's defiance, Modi's pragmatism, and China's measured restraint reflected the diverse ways BRICS nations navigated the crisis, but the underlying tension was universal. A world increasingly divided between those who upheld the old order and those who sought to reshape it. The uncertain future. By mid-July 2025, the tariff war remained unresolved. Trump's August 1 deadline loomed, with negotiations ongoing but outcomes uncertain. The BRICS nations, despite their public unity, grappled with internal divisions. China and Russia's geopolitical ambitions clashed with India's cautious balancing act and Brazil's focus on regional leadership. The U.S., meanwhile, faced its own challenges, with market volatility and rising inflation undermining Trump's narrative of economic strength. The tariff war was a microcosm of a larger struggle, a contest between unilateral power and multilateral cooperation, between the dollar's dominance and the dream of a multipolar world. Whether Trump's tariffs would force BRICS nations to bend or galvanize their resolve remained to be seen. What was clear was that the global economic landscape was shifting, and the consequences would reverberate for years to come.